Hi, and good afternoon. Welcome to our panel. Energy storage is the key to unlocking a fully renewable future. With an efficient and reliable way to store energy, we can maximize the benefits of wind, solar, hydroelectric energy, and provide access to sorely needed underserved communities. Addressing the challenge will mean investing in new technologies and scaling solutions in order to create a cleaner and more equitable planet for future generations. I'm Sarah Forster, news editor at The National, and I'm joined by my esteemed guests here who I feel have already been introduced, but I will introduce them again. We have Andy Biffen, Asset Development Executive Director at Emirates Water and Electricity Company, Matthew Clare from Masdar Arlington, and Rizwan Razaq, CTO at Huawei. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So if I can just start with you, Rizwan. I'd like to talk about advancing next-generation energy storage technologies beyond lithium-ion batteries. Can you tell us what research and development efforts are needed in order to make that happen?
Sure. So as a technology provider and an integrator of energy storage across the globe, the extensive research required in order to adopt the new types of technologies requires the lengthy process of testing and verification and the level of R&D development, such as what we've done in the lithium-ion at the moment, where that has taken over 10 years before we deployed a safe, reliable solution to the market itself. So we obviously have seen lead-acid batteries being utilized for years before. Lithium-ion has now become profitable in a sense where, in the scale of the projects themselves, can be ramped up quite extensively. And we've seen that in projects such as in the Red Sea, 1.3 gigawatt-hour microgrid application. Going forward, we do see upcoming shifts from lithium-ion, but the extent of research at this stage is still undergoing. So aspects such as sodium-ion is something that the teams are working on at the moment. But the extent of testing and verification requires at least a few more years before those types of technologies become viable enough to utilize in a safe and a reliable solution. Yeah.
Thank you. Matthew, talking about one of the most important parts of this area, sustainable and ethical sourcing of raw materials, how can we ensure that that's done when it comes to battery production and address concerns about the environmental and social impacts that are associated with mining and the processing of these materials?
Sure. So I think, first of all, the ESG is an important pillar of all of Masdar's procurement. So it's a very important aspect that we try to drill down into as much as possible. And that can be more complicated the more layers of the supply chain that are involved. So you have integrators and they have a supply chain of many subcontractors that all the way down to the lithium itself. And so we do a lot of work ourselves. We work with consultants to try and really get under the bonnet of the supply chain's commitment to ESG. And I think it's fair to say that it's a relatively new area for a number of them. I don't think the first wave of deployment, which has been predominantly private equity led, have done as much homework. I don't think the lenders within market have been as hot on it as perhaps they should, but we are seeing that we're trying to be a driving force behind that. The other important thing that needs to be considered alongside that is the kind of end of life and recycling capability of what happens to the lithium at the end of life. And when we say end of life, we're talking 15, 17 years down to about 60% capacity. So those systems still have a use, and I think it's important that we as a company, but also as an industry, find a way to deploy those into other economies that require more power-based services than capacity, because your degradation is just on the capacity element. But also really push the supply chain, and work's underway to do this already, to look more into how the lithium can be kind of taken back in and then repurposed, reused, there is development in that already, and also more modular recycling to make sure that the carbon footprint of that entire process is reduced as much as possible, so that you have an asset that is deployed in the UK, it is then recycled at end of life, either to another kind of closer by second market, or actually just repurposed facilities in the UK. It's a new area, but it's an extremely important one that is developing, and we have a firm eye on exactly our obligations, but also the supply chain's obligations in that.
Andy, my next question is for you, but I just would ask Rizwan if you want to weigh in on the same topic.
Yep, I think as an aspect of a vendor and technology provider, the extent of research and bankability products is something that is a concerning point. We've seen that ramp up on scale on the containerized batteries at this stage, go from scales of 2 megawatt to, as we've seen in the market, 6-8 megawatt hour in the same facility. But are we doing the necessary due diligence in the technology such as the lithium ion, the cell type, the technology verification process? So, vendors, grid operators don't see down to that granular level. So the extent of research and vendors to standardize the actual impact on the qualification process is something that needs to be expanded on. We are working with close consultants, as mentioned from Masdar side as well, to ensure that these get illustrated and implemented as soon as possible in a safe and reliable way.
Andy, let's talk policy and regulatory framework. How can those be designed to really effectively incentivize the deployment of energy storage at various scales?
Okay, so I think the first thing to separate in the discussion is that we're not a merchant market here. So, it's a closed market. We develop projects, we invite parties in, and we set a tariff. So, first off, the purpose for a battery in this market would be for ancillary services, essentially. So, when we develop a project, it's centered around provision of those services. That's the base case. In a merchant market, I think many people will be aware, you're looking at energy arbitrage, so you're looking at a price for those, for megawatts. You're basically trading megawatts. You're charging up when energy is low and prices are low, and you're discharging when they're high. So to develop our first EWEC project, we've had to look at that in a slightly new way to form that business case. In terms of the grid code, there are things that need to be reconsidered, again, associated with ancillary services, because a battery can perform way more than a synchronous generator. So the services that it provide aren't actually written into that grid code, into that regulation at the moment. So I think that does need to catch up. I'm sure that will happen over time.
How much time are you thinking?
Well, the regulation is always being reviewed. It's an ongoing process. The first battery project, like I say, will provide ancillary services. The particular one we look at is primary frequency response, for example. So that's when the discharge of the battery is sent into the network as frequency drops, and it will far outperform a synchronous generator. So we're talking about months, years for that regulation to catch up.
So I think just in terms of regulation in the UK, because it's a very different application market, it started life as a more enhanced frequency type service. We had some regulatory issues around double charging on BESS import-export, co-location with solar, that you'd lose to ROCs, and that's been worked out. We now find ourselves in another regulatory kind of tangle where there's an oversupply for capacity on the grid, data centres, battery developers, solar developers. The grid can't handle it, doesn't know quite how to do that, and so we're stuck in a lot of grid reform at the moment. And I think one of the issues that needs to be unbundled slightly is National Grid in the UK implementing that policy to try and do the right thing and to size the market, but actually also allowing assets online which are ultimately merchant assets, and the merchant market should determine how many BESS get built if there's still simple kind of economic mechanics that if it's worth doing, you do it.
Great. Matthew, I'm going to stick with you if that's all right. And we're going to talk about a topic that is very current in the minds of many consumers, and that is addressing critical concerns around fire prevention, thermal management, the safe handling of battery chemicals. How can we ensure the safety of large-scale BESS systems when addressing those concerns?
Sure. So good question, and I think it talks to one of the points earlier that there's a real push to get as many megawatt hours into smaller spaces as possible. Especially in the UK, we are quite short on land. It's no secret. And with that innovation and with that desire for greater density comes concerns around safety. So if you look at a number of the examples of where things have gone wrong, I think that's a good place to start as to how you future-proof yourself, but also just a general commitment to actually putting that on your agenda. There is almost an infinite amount of money that you could spend trying to make that happen. You need to find a corporately responsible middle ground for that. A lot of emphasis goes onto supply chain, but also ourselves to check that the fire suppression systems have been sized appropriately for our application. If we start wanting to do more aggressive things with the battery, trade it more, it naturally needs more auxiliary power to power the fire suppression system. So quite often issues occur when the battery is being pushed to do things that it's not comfortable with and was never designed to. And so really you just need to keep a monitor on that. There's a lot of technology development in AI of actually second guessing when errors are going to occur before they do. And so we're exploring a lot of that. And I could probably talk on that topic for a lot longer, but I'll free up some time to take the other questions. But
well, I actually just want to pass over to Rizwan, obviously Chief Technology Officer at Huawei.
Yeah, so from that aspect, rightfully mentioned, we've got to look at the historical problems, how they have arisen, and ensure that the products and solutions that are being available in the market are able to limit the challenges from the past itself. So, we've seen that in battery storage projects specifically. Operation and maintenance is quite a big challenge. Other aspects is the suppression system. Is it digitalized? Is it utilizing the size of the facility itself? And what is the protocols and methods implemented for the suppression system itself? So methods that we have utilized is, as we've been in the PV sector for several years already, we're using modular technology in the power converters, and we've also implemented that in the ESS facilities as well. So using modular pack applications for initial safety, but also to ensure that that digitalization can be utilized from the EMS application itself to ensure that from both sides it's a cost-effective approach.
And moving on to Andy, I'd like to ask you about business models, market mechanisms, and the innovation that's taking place in these areas. What can be done to really unlock the full value of energy storage?
Yeah, thank you. So again, I think with batteries, you've got two distinct models. The type of developer that we see in a merchant market is one that is trading power prices, and a battery is ideal as something to give them some security around those power prices and give them a mechanism to trade with. With our particular model, we're looking at securing capacity and making a safe payment for that capacity with very little risk for the owner of that battery. So what we've had to look at EWEC is a mechanism very much structured around our conventional IWPP type model, where you have investors that will procure a technology, develop the project, and have the safety of the security of those capacity payments, whereby really the only risk they're left with is things like operation and maintenance risk, which can quite often, in most cases, be backed off by warranties, guarantees, or other service type agreements. it sort of begs the question, what's left in it for the developer of these projects, because they become quite small projects. Although the capex is a lot, it becomes a smaller project than a conventional sort of gas-fired project or a solar project. But that's the model we're running with the sort of first phase of batteries. Like I say, we've got the first battery project in development at the moment, bids in at the end of this month, so exciting time.
An exciting time, absolutely. Would you like to weigh in, Matthew?
Yeah, sure. I think the UK is just a very different example. It's probably at the far end of the merchant strategy, if you like. And we are constantly pushing the boundaries of what the battery needs to do and what we want it to do. We want the warranties to be as flexible as possible, with no or minimal downtime between a full export and a full import, or vice versa. And again, that's where you start, that introducing heat that needs to be managed, and the heat ultimately is what drives issues on the warranty. So we put a lot of work into assessing those factors and actually our use case when considering the kind of acquisition cost of the batteries, because we are asking it to do a number of very different things than the UK 7-8 years ago, which were frequency dominated, which use at maximum kind of 20% of the power requirement, up or down.
Okay, let's talk about really integrating large-scale energy storage into the existing grid infrastructure and kind of trying to ensure that seamless coordination with other grid components. Andy, do you want to, it's a question for everyone, but Andy, do you want to start?
Yeah, so again, EWEC as a system operator, so we understand the economics of our grid, the way that plant is dispatched on an economic basis. Again, I mentioned ancillary services a few times, but the way that we would look at a battery as a way of saving fuel for the provision of ancillary services from other sources, so generally other gas turbine plant that would normally be running or be in some sort of backup mode to provide those services. A battery is ideal for the provision of those services because it can do so from a standing start in literally milliseconds. So it's perfect for assisting the operability of the network. So it's ideal for the system operator. And again, our system operator isn't there to trade energy. He's really just there for the operability. I think again, depends a lot on economics of the battery and the tariffs that we receive on the first bid, but it may be that we see other projects that come through simply to stabilize the network as we get more and more introduction of renewable energy, particularly solar. I always give the example of the sort of the perfect storm at the end of the day, sort of 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. We've got all of this solar energy that's all coming off, falling in generation simply because of the sun setting, and we have to pick that up with real energy. We will always have those gas turbines or other sources of energy on standby, ready to pick up that predicted reduction in solar energy. If a gas turbine fails to start or can't pick up load or something like that, then it will be the job of the battery to pick up and give you that security.
Mm. And Matthew, what about in the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK, there's a bit of a misunderstanding of how batteries actually work, and I think that gap will be plugged with data, operational data. But the way in which policy and regulation runs in the UK, you have the distribution companies, you have National Grid, which is split into different departments, which look after different things, policy and the actual infrastructure. And they accept projects at distribution level and transmission, and the interface is quite an interesting world at the moment. What that is leading to is a misconception that a battery comes online, it has an import-export connection, it's in an area that has lots of renewable generation, which are export assets. At the moment, it's being layered on top, the BES is being layered on top, and that kind of crashes the design model and the engineering behind how the grid actually operates. But in actuality, if all of the renewables are at full export, it means that pricing theoretically is going to be pretty cheap. And so the chances of your battery then wanting to export at the same time is very low. And so there just needs to be a bit more of an operational development in terms of National Grid taking our data, understanding how it works, actually on the system rather than just modelling it on paper, which is also leading to a lot of reform on required infrastructure works that on paper look like they're needed, but actually if you use the system properly and use the batteries efficiently, they can actually help the system. There are other issues of inertia that are showing their faces. Coal and gas comes offline. But that's kind of the, I guess, the second bounce of the ball.
I'll expand on that as well, just partly in terms of the technology components such as the key items such as the PCS. We've seen most of these kind of renewable assets being grid following, and in the coming years when the grid infrastructure is now changing, becoming more weaker, we are needing to utilize these items in a more grid forming fashion and more as a stability aspect. And as we've seen, a large amount of solar has already been adopted, and now we're looking at quite large scales of gigawatt scale energy storage. So the standards are changing, and items such as grid forming components are required. Now, obviously, the expansion on what does that grid forming really mean, how does that tolerate, and how does that function in the right fashion for that specific grid, as the fluctuations start occurring and grids become weaker year on year.
Yeah.
Well, it feels appropriate to end with a question about the future, which I'm no doubt sure we will see. Thank you, gentlemen. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to our guests.
Thank you.